Hello everyone, today we talk about 10th to 11th century Rome and more specifically of the warlike clan of the Crescensi. Among the prominent noble clans that during this period seized control of Rome's unfolding narrative, families that often met and battled one another, first against the Ottonians and then the Salian dynasties themselves, the Crescensi stand definitely out as especially noteworthy, right? When we think about medieval Rome in general, we have this impression of, well, it's basically the Papacy, right? What else was there? And that's, of course, important and probably also underrated in the general relevance in our medieval history narratives in pop culture. But there is a lay Rome, which is definitely way less considered. Inexplicably so. This probably in part derives from the denial of essentially a civilized urban Roman legacy within the same urbs in medieval millennium, right? If Rome is the Papacy, remember that this was sort of demonized, especially from the Reformation onwards, right? And that Roman history up to that point was particularly considered also as far as the medieval side of the story is because its narrative fundamentally was one of the single most known through like the chronicles of the era that were already studied at the time, the centrality of Rome being unscathed in that sense. From the other, there is in fact the sense that from the end of the western administrative half of the empire, basically Rome is not that particularly worth of consideration other than, again, the sort of spiritual dimension. We forget that this technically was the largest city in the West, and that essentially most of the cultural development that occurred in Latin Germanic Europe stemmed from the urbs throughout the Middle Ages, of course also through the church. There is this, in fact, lack of exposure to the notion that the aforementioned civilization had a rooted, right, cornerstone function in the balance of the major powers at the time. The Roman clans that are truly very powerful, these are the baronial families that at some point we will have to look at, especially for also the later Middle Ages. Everybody knows the Colonna, the Orsini, but even for them, like how many people do actually acknowledge how intense and vast this Roman history is in medieval times. Rome is less documented, for example, during the communal era compared to other communes, but still in absolute terms, by European standards, and so world standards at large, is very well documented. The houses of the Crescensi are a famous monument in Rome, typical of, but it's close to the Temple of Vesta. It's a typical early Romanesque style with a lot of classical influences still, that at some point we may see, maybe in a bit about the history of art. We don't make many of those anyway. Thus, if especially that is your view of the Middle Ages, it's a bit difficult to understand how these clans could really be the tip of the European and Mediterranean balance of the time. You may know of some sort of feudal families, may know of, the Achaia and Constantinople. And indeed, we say do not look much at that in pop culture either, right? So you can say that people make an intense history of, say, the ducas from, aside from their the imperial reign. Nor we focus particularly much on this or that sort of provincial lord's house. For Rome, it's a bit the same, and it's even more unique in its own regard. The Crescensi were profoundly dedicated to a political and sort of broader, also moral rise that would play a pivotal role, in fact, in revitalizing and advancing the same city that had actually a pretty consistent power, especially in the surrounding province of Latium, that had some sub areas that are very historical ones in in also the development of a lot of movements, right, from monastically wise, think about Monte Cassino or Farfa, right, but also like important towns that Rome has some sort of control over, not just through the papacy that of course overlaps at point with this lay polity, as we will see with the Crescensi that also have their own popes unavoidably, but properly from this private, clanic, militarized, and very rich, very powerful nobility that, in a sense, walks in the footsteps of the older senatorial, large estate owners that were, of course, though changed in the substance, also in the scale, etc., but fundamentally continuing in this territory. That was one of the most advanced in Europe. If you know Tuber's studies, you know that fundamentally Lazio is the first province from which Encastellation in Europe starts, as early as the first decades of the 10th century, especially after the Saracen pirate base in the mouth of the Garigliano River in the south had been obliterated. Comparatively on the Baltic, like Encastellation, that sort of solid, more materials of stone-built fortifications is something that, occurs 2 centuries later, right? And there would be a lot to say about that. It would surely make some agrarian or seigneurial history videos based on the fortifications of the Roman countryside. But just for saying that we're talking a big deal, without mentioning, of course, all the issue of the Renovatio Imperii, the 10th century, the Ottonians, and more, in such a cosmopolitan city like Rome is, with various scholars from all the various peoples, from including the Saxons, by the way, the Franks, and others, that literally had their own guilds within the city, participated to its intense urban warfare, by the way. And so all things that we will at some point give the adequate space to. Now, aristocratic lineages such as the Crescensi embodied in a way the collective ambitions of Rome's inhabitants. Rome had never ceased, even for an instant, to be the single most important international center in Latin Germanic Europe. The centrality now was even more strengthened by the aforementioned Renovatio Imperii, starting from Charlemagne, but that, as we've seen in many videos about Merovingian or Anglo-Saxon history, had been there since ever. You can't say really there is a gap, right, between the Roman senatorial families, in fact the papal episcopal ones, in the management of the connection with Western Europe. So that's the perspective we should really recover. I made a video about Rome in the reign of Charles III, so the very last imperial Carolingian ruler that, as we have seen, was divided between the pro-Eastern and, from the other side, pro-Western Frankish party, because, of course, from those Transalpine realms, there was a very intense interaction with Rome that aimed at having this or that ruler to be now recognized as the in the sole way an emperor now could be recognized as Roman in the West. So these aristocratic families were fully aware of this, right, and dramatically active about it in the same way. They engaged in the same governance of the church, right? Great part of the Ottonian rhetoric of epuration of the church for its reversal, like in a pure sanctified form, that paradoxically would be collected by the Gregorians against the same empire in the following century, stems from the interference of these Roman families in the papal election, simply because at large the Roman popes had been, in early medieval times, an expression, members of these local Roman families. The Crescensi being, again, one of the most famous, more powerful. There is all, again, a long history of of Roman clans. At some point we could look even at the least known, because they all had a space in this, and they all played an important part in the broader game of the church, and not only. The Crescensi convened within the Senate, because there was a Senate of Rome throughout all this period, and established a firm foothold in the districtus, that is, as we said before, would pertain essentially to Rome as a broader province. And so the idea that the urbs could tower and rule over, in fact, these various towns in an imperial guise, fundamentally. In my video about medieval Lazio, I explained how this game played out, because basically the papal signory was adverse by the same Roman commune to a degree, because of broader ambitions of autonomy, led, say, pushed by the people, but led, of course, by these barons, that paradoxically brought the Pope to root with these other towns surrounding Rome that were too small compared to Rome, of course, to be individually crucial, but that all coalesced with, the papal power on top could fundamentally not completely choke Roman autonomy. There was a commune of Rome. At some point, the Pope is also, as you know, overthrown. That's when Frederick Barbarossa has to come to Italy in the first expedition, etc. I talked about this even recently in a video about the Papacy, the Normans, and the Germanic rulers. However, effectively installing the Papacy as the lordship of Rome, and so bringing to a very different outcome compared to other communes, that should not, in this sense, bring us to underestimate, in fact, the power of the city of Rome, even during the Papacy. I will talk about the Roman army, that again is a separated thing, by the way, from the papal one, strictly net. So there are different layers here. We're talking ancien regime, we're talking different estates, different institutions at a time. More crucially, the Crescensi exercised influence through the powerful mechanism of the papal office, though, that already at this point, of course, was the most important in the city. At various times, they aligned themselves with either the papacy or the empire, because this was the other big game. There were the Guelphs and the Ghibellines later on, right? But by this point, if you look at the root concept, the same thing is already there. Through a flurry of sly strategies, ruthless methods, and swift changes in loyalty, the Crescensi capitalized on both the vigor and the vulnerabilities of civic and ecclesiastical bodies, substantially enriching their holdings. Right? Because at the end of the day, we're in the High Middle Ages. Yes, in Italy, cities are important. Rome is the city par excellence in the history of mankind. But we're living in a sort of also, as you know, Latin Germanic vassalatic beneficiary system of sort, where these clans are actually military in nature. They are landlords. They have house towers. They fundamentally maintain a knightly lifestyle, rendering also the city pretty dynamic. Let's put it in this pretty cinetic, so to say. Meaning it was a lot of internal strife, and within the Aurelian walls, of course, the city was much smaller at that point than that, but there was enough space for having this manifestation of really big powers backed also from the countryside, this private holdings. And it would be really interesting to make a history of the Roman countryside from, for example, an archaeological point of view, looking at, in terms of settlement, what was there, because unfortunately, and I had the privilege to work with people who studied this exactly, if archaeologists, for example, receive a certain amount of money to dig something, and they have the opportunity of doing so in Rome or surroundings, or central Italy, let's say, they will unavoidably try to search more, also because they have to find something. The ancient stuff, the classical stuff, and one of the dreadful outcomes of this is that the medieval side of the story gets neglected, to the point that a few people are actually studying this are basically telling us quite loudly that there was an entire early medieval urban continuity from Roman times that nobody has ever historiographically objectivized, and that basically would redraw the entire history of the region during this period and beyond. Like literally, there were some cities that existed that today, like on a normal sort of historical map, you wouldn't find it, that we're actually finding. Sometimes also in that indirect way, searching for ancient stuff, but discovering that, say, I don't know, in the 7th century, there were thriving towns that at some point were abandoned, etc., within also the wake of the continuing late antique decadence, but that evidently continued much longer. This is what we understand from so many indicators than the notion of the fall of the empire, the Gothic War, and so on. So, on occasion, these aristocrats, anyway, spurred by an arrogant yearning for independent dominance, especially over the city, but also its countryside, chose to sever ties with both the imperial throne and the papal altar almost at once, right? This would be fatal for the Crescensi, that evidently thought, however, that they could literally defy both universal powers, right? While finally succumbing to forces that were mightier than their own, still making a hell of a stand, demonstrating that the mere control over the herbs really had always meant, up to this point and beyond, the control on truly a universal scale policy. The Crescensi constitute a distinguished bloodline, by the way, rising to prominence in Rome from the mid-10th century. Of course, their lineage was older. We know just a few about the general information, like in detail, from the previous centuries, but we know what kind of clans ruled the city from the end of the empire. And essentially, again, those had maintained that level of senatorial power, resized compared to the days of glory of the peak of the Roman Empire, yet still, as we've seen, incredibly powerful. And from this mid-10th century, the Crescensi would extend their reach into Sabina, that is, as you know, in the northeast of Rome, and considered where Farfai, the very powerful abbey of Farfai, is, towards the mountains, reaching, in fact, very interesting strategic locations for the control of the Apennine passes, and the Maritime in the south of Rome. It is called like this because it's basically the coastal band, like in the south of Rome. The interland part was known as Campania, which literally means countryside. So the Crescensi were also active participants in the city's rivalries during the Tusculan period. That refers to the powerful counts of Tusculan, in fact, on the Roman hills just south, the Alban Hill, like also some of the most importantly metaphysical locations in the history of mankind. It would, unsurprisingly, actually cultivate a Ghibelline ethos during the Middle Ages, and we'll get to that as well. Though this recounting of the Crescensi revisits events partly, as we have already documented in other videos, I think it is important to present the family with a clearer picture, right, of their saga and their impact on Roman development, so that they're not lost to history or simply this undefinable, right, thing that goes on YouTube that we sometimes call historical. Early on, the probable founder of the Crescensi dynasty took part in a gathering in the Urbs hosted by Louis III, dubbed the Child, in 902, right? We're at the time of Rollo, you know the story, right? By 942, the same individual is recorded at a meeting under Alberic II, revealing through such actions his and his relatives' commitment, enhancing the Senate and the administration Omnium Romanorum in front of the Marquis of Tuscany. If you're interested in this, you can check out the video made on Duke of Provence, and most of the opposition that he received from various Italian provinces, including Rome. Skillfully navigating the tensions between opposing groups, the Crescensi managed in 965 to elevate one of their own, John, to the papal throne, where he took the name John the 13th. With his support, they swiftly gained possession of Palestrina and its nearby lands, in 970, a gift from the new pope to John's sister Stephania. Right, and this is a very important passage because it shows Palestrina was a very fortified stronghold. That later on the same colonna that we were actually hinting at before would entrench themselves. That's what Boniface VIII would raise to the ground in Dante's time. You must absolutely come back on those topics. So you have the papacy that in virtue of his own lordship over basically the patrimonium of St. Peter, and there is all the ambiguity of who does what exactly belong to, because again, the patrimony is metaphysical in nature. I made an entire video about this, and technically there are communities that respond to the emperor as well. And at this point, we're not right. We are in Ottonian times, so we're not without imperial authority in the radar. And this pope basically gifts his own sister his own family of this powerful stronghold. By the way, Stephania's sons, so John's nephews, would later receive the entirety of Sabina, at least for what it was possible, because of course it's not like they could simply take over the entire system, but there were vassals, there were knights, etc. So that in theory, like the lordship over the entirety of Sabina, and this important, as we've seen, highway into central Italy was that crucial for the same papal strategy. This obviously starkly demonstrates how a noble family could amass wealth and authority by exploiting the prestige of having a vicar of Christ within their ranks. In the years that followed, the Crescensi political orientation remained steadfast. After John XIII's demise, Emperor Otto I backed an imperial pontiff according to the normal practice that the Saxons had established in Italy. This concept of bishops counts. With the case of Rome, it was a bit different, but at least having a loyal pope meant a lot. Benedict VI was his name, though he had a brief pontificate, 970-974. So at this point, Crescentius de Theodora acted decisively, assassinating the Pope, right, and placing the anti-Pope Boniface, that of course had to be a Pope in their view, Boniface VII, in his stead. That thus happened in parallel. At this juncture, Crescentius, perhaps doubting his ability to resist imperial might, against which he had undoubtedly posed himself, moved to bolster his and his family's standing by aligning with the emperor and the new Roman bishop that was a Saxon ally. We're talking literally the following pope, and so yes, Crescentius basically kills the imperial pope, so to say, but he manages to get away with that, and he actually allies himself at this point with the emperor and the new pope. Of course, like here, we should go much more in depth in the actual context. Here we're just making a summary of Crescentius, of the Crescensi rather, as a family, right? So there are lots of details to this. We'll talk about this in a more straightforward history of Rome during those years, but just for giving you an idea of who these people were and what kind of actions they could fundamentally carry out without losing immediately power just per se. So this shift towards the emperor, as suggested, quickly yielded results even. Right? In 975, Benedict of the Crescensi of Sabina, because these clans had different branches, by the way, and they were properly the same military clans. We talked about them, especially in the videos about the genesis of the Italian communes, the militia, the milites, the knightly consular class that established communes and so on. This is very similar. Like these are big clans, like hundreds of people. Some of them are knights, other lawyers. They're all powerful, and they have this wide, assets that they partially share, and they branch in different parts of the district. In this case, of the Roman countryside. So it's very complicated, very complex. There is infighting, by the way, between these branches at a point, but at the same time, the goal is to keep this power within family, so to say. And in fact, this Benedict of the Crescensi of Sabina emerges bearing the title of Patricius, so patrician. Just yesterday, actually, I was talking about the sacred meaning of the patriciate in traditional societies. And remember here what patricius means. It's not just the legalistic sort of even Byzantine-sounding thing. No, this is literally Rome. And you have the notion from the side of these families. These do actually descend from the patres. They are illustrious families. As we were saying before, exactly about the genetic continuity of the patriciate, like these people's blood is considered to be superior, like just the one of the milites at this point. We are in the same period in which knighthood, as we know it as a military class in the High Middle Ages, is starting to be uniformly recognized, affirms itself, right? And basically, Benedict acquires through this title a position that unlocked opportunities to rule the city and even affect papal elections, because the patrician here was a higher recognition within a sort of more, surely also, as I said before, a Byzantine influence system, but it was just like a patrician above being a patrician. I mean, it's a prelenient categorical understanding that you are definitely a patrician, and then of course also people of your own blood fundamentally are. So it's all a traditional blending and intertwinement of this imperial manifestation at the end of the day. And it's mostly like a singular title. It's something more monarchic within Rome than else, even though this was no monarchy for sure. John, of whom we, like other sources of the time, we'll see it later, will refer to as Nomentanus for simplicity, because they had possessions in around this areas, like we will see it particularly better later. But as you know, the Via Nomentana is the Roman road that, leaving the urbs, crosses Sabina. So it makes sense, because it's, if these people come from a Sabine background, the Nomentana road is where their estates are also dislocated, right? And so John later pivoted again, distancing himself from the imperial faction and aligning with the Byzantine Empire, which was yet another actor here, because the Papacy, Rome, never really break context, like in terms of, as they saw it, being able to handle both empires at the same time, until the first half of the 12th century. Essentially, Manuel Comnenus' ill-fated but almost successful chance of knocking out the Siculo-Normans, right? And so, in this central Italian position, you have, in Mediterranean, you have like essentially the continental empire from one side, the Aegean one from another. You were literally like decentralized in between. That's why these Roman clans were also so powerful, because they could so easily make leverage on the city, from which all this power at the end of the day stemmed from historically. The entire imperial power in the world stemmed exclusively from Rome. Everybody knew it at the time. There was never an end to that concept throughout any part of the Middle Ages. And so that's why these families were feeling so entitled, by the way, because it was their city, as a matter of fact. And they were, if anything, the true real Romans of the wall, in a strictly ethnocultural continuity from antiquity, regardless, of course, of the metaphysical Romanity of the empire. It's very important also from a genetic point of view, as were pointed out, but hence titles like Patrician, etc. So aligning with the Byzantine Empire, of course, meant at this point, remember the times, to abandon the Saxon line and triggering the infamous retaliations of Otto III that had a very complicated relation with Rome and Romanity from his ancestry, from his background, and in fact, also in this case, ill-fated attempt to simply rule from Rome. Yet Otto III would rule literally from the Palatine Hill, like the old emperors, like having his court there and so on, but eventually being overthrown by the same Romans, and signifying also this broader decline. Exactly moments in which very important popes were to affirm themselves, also with a much more sort of grandiose universal vision, even that these Roman noblemen that in part inherited that, but were reasoning, especially during the 10th century, in more local terms. For, as we've seen, the Latio imperative, for this overwhelming imperial power restoration within the same herbs that affected them, but as we've seen, was not enough to basically eliminate them, which would have been much easier as an outcome for the emperors themselves. Instead, that's the point. Rome is not simply the Pope; it's these noble clans that live in them. It's the people of Rome that all have, by the way, their own prerogatives during the imperial crowning. If the people of Rome does not acclaim you during the ceremony, you cannot become emperor, right? So there is this is a big city. It's populous. It's wealthy. So they don't simply control it. Again, ask Otto III or anyone that at some point also had to come back north of the Alps, to be very concrete, while the Romans remain in Rome. Now, entering the 11th century, the Crescensi adopted a more prudent approach. They showed respect towards Popes John the 28th, 1003, 1009, and Sergius IV, 1009, 1012, while also fostering amicable ties with Emperor II, the final Saxon Bavarian branch ruler, the uncle of Otto III. They appeared to aid him by repeatedly favoring his relatives, though in truth they obstructed his tangible efforts to claim the crown. You know that Henry II was involved in a pretty brutal war in northern Italy against essentially the last Italic attempt to not just say of proper royal and imperial independence from the Eastern Franks, right? That ended up in defeat. But in all this, the Romans were watching in the center of the peninsula, and we will have to look at that, because the outcome was, yes, the monarchy failed, but the communes rose, and so those were the ones who eventually took up arms against the same emperor. And as you know, at that point, well, we are in later times, the Gregorian reforms have already happened, but it's at that point the Papacy, it's Rome, fueling the wealth resistance of the Lombard League against the Suevians. Now, back in time, again, this period, where the beginning of the 11th century, marks the initial barrier to the Crescensi growth, right? A second, more perilous and nearly unsurmountable challenge emerges from the aforementioned Tusculan family, with whom they first formed an alliance, only to later fade from prominence, subdued by the overwhelming force of the Tusculans' triumph. Again, these clans were all very warlike. There are big urban clashes. Literally, the biggest urban battles in medieval Europe are the ones taking place in Rome, at least in the West. And again, with a degree of bellicosity that is really typical, not just of Italy during the Middle Ages, but of Rome in particular. There are some battles that are immense, like, for example, the one when Henry VII was crowned we will surely talk about that. But just for instance, how many of you have ever heard of this? Literally the largest urban battles in the entire Middle Ages that we're aware of, that we can document, that we can reconstruct. Again, pop culture. Now, this shift in the, fundamentally, like with this decline, with the Crescensi, happened when, fueled by arrogance, they decided they could forego the backing of both the empire and the papacy at the same time. As you see here, there are other families too, so it's even a more complicated game. But having the two major universal authorities that were striving for maintaining control of Rome against, it's not really a great strategy. Politically, again, this shows how powerful the Crescensi were, nevertheless. To fully grasp the ascent, spread, and eventual fall of the noble Crescensi bloodline, it helps to delve into the lives of key figures within it, specifically Crescentius Nomentanus and Crescentius, the son of Benedict, right? By the way, we were talking just about the crescent the other day in the traditional Catholic meaning of the same, and of course this was well augurating an auspicious term that literally refers to the growth of power. And so the name in itself, regardless of the etymologies, there are all stories regarding this Roman noble families' ancestry and proper beginnings, like including nickname that they received, because that's how in the Middle Ages fundamentally surnames were affirmed here. Again, I will not descend into it, but it's a fascinating story. Now, Crescentius, which is a hallmark also of centrality within the clan, right? It would have been some Crescensi that were called in other ways, but if you call yourself Crescentius, it's because you are essentially the first guy, right? You are the one who tends to lead everything. It must bear the same name. This idea of continuity of the race that is incredibly present in the original ancestral meaning of the patriciate. Crescentius Nomentanus is fortunate enough to be noted by two prominent chronicles of the time that are John the Deacon, who references him in the Chronicum Venetum, so we are in northeastern Italy specifically, and Bonizza of Sutri. Sutri is a city, a town near Rome, and we talked about this also in a video because the emperor and the pope at the beginning of the 12th century sort of met there, that they signed a very important agreement that in theory would have separated fully, like the temporal and the spiritual dimensions. They knew it was just ideal, but they needed it for political reasons, both respectively in Germany and in Rome. But just for saying that these cities have an enormous history, they date back to ancient classical times and even before, because again, the settlement continuity, the level of urbanization is really enormous. I made a video about the Latium Vetus in like we're talking the 8th, the 7th century BC, and we documented there like how these towns were already present, and they were proper civitates, as a matter of fact. The term is accurately city, except for the Roman countryside. These towns have less of a communal development compared to other parts of central and northern Italy, mostly because of the papacy, but in the centrality of Rome in general, and so they would be subordinated to the urbs. All sources we know are biased, always. Nevertheless, in different ways, and there is a truth, there is an objectivity. Now, Bonizza of Sutri is often criticized for partiality, especially in his Liber ad Amicum, a work tied to the Gregorian faction. So we're talking almost 1 century later, where he recounts individuals and incidents from, in fact, this even more than a century before. The obvious logic is that the Gregorians were, of course, proponents of, as we said before, ecclesiastical purification from lay interference. at that point in the history of the papacy, whether from the emperor or any other layman, as these local barons could be. At that point, the papacy had become a monarchy on its own, the Curia really being something independent in its own institutional regard. Nevertheless, we are relatively well documented about this Crescentius Nomentanus. The pacts, wars, and acts of treachery, while not always taken to their fullest extent, render the episodes of this man's life unforgettable. Born around the mid-10th century to Crescentius de Theodora, he hails from the Roman segment of the Crescensi family. Bonizzo labels him Nomentanus, possibly a distinction used in the 11th century, perhaps linked to his ownership, as we've seen, of properties in the Romano-Sabine region spanning the Salaria and Nomentana roads, so in the northeast. John the Deacon, on the other hand, mixes him up with his brother John, a senator in Rome. Bonizzo occasionally repeats this error too. Regardless, the individual that we, for convenience, also call Crescentius Nomentanus often surfaces in documents and happenings along his sibling. Independently, though, he secures the country of Terracina in the south of Rome, like on the coast, from Pope John XV, 984-985, and from 991 onward takes on the role of Roman senator as well. Throughout this time, he fosters positive ties with both the pontiff and the emperor. Following the death of Teophano, Otto III's mother, Byzantine princess, Crescentius establishes himself in Rome, right, where he too assumes a senatorial position. Yet in carrying out his responsibilities, he somehow irks the church. Gerberto Aurillac, partly due to his ruthless tactics for extracting funds from the Pope, brands him in rem as diaboli membrum, so a limb of the devil, calling him domineering, corrupt, and lacking in moral fiber. By the way, Gerberto Aurillac, famously enough, not confused to what I often remind in Otto of Cluny's biography of Gerald of Aurillac, would be the very famous Pope Sylvester II. It's sort of funny that there is a black legend on Sylvester II as literally having been initiated by Satan because he was so, knowledgeable also in magic, in science, etc., that, he would have received this from the Antichrist, that he called Crescentius a limb of the devil. Of course, Gerbert did not leave to know that he would have been attached this black legend. So this is all the anti-papistic weird sort of distortion of reality. About, by the way, one of the single greatest individuals in the entire history of mankind. I mean, Sylvester II is what I was saying. I was made a video about him, but we have to come back sort of more seriously on the figure. Probably the universal breadth of the papal temporal awareness, not just the spiritual one in Rome. I mean, Gerberto Aurillac is basically the soul of that would allow for the papal monarchy to blossom in the following generations. And at this point, he was Archbishop of Rome. A hell of a curriculum. Normally, like if you were Archbishop of Rome, you would, especially at this point, tend to end up Pope anyway. Hence, we see also the connection, the very well known Roman affairs abroad. Right? This was, again, I'm sorry to make a video like this without contextualizing further, saying what was happening in the rest of Europe, because it was all revolving around the Crescensi. Whatever they did, the rest of Europe knew, and as witnessed here, not just from an ecclesiastical perspective, but even as we've seen with the imperial one, etc. In any case, after John, forcing backlash, Crescentius, as senator, reconciles with Pope John XV. But after the latter's passing, Gregory XV takes over, solidifying his authority with his cousin Otto III, so yet another sort of German pope, and sternly condemns Nomentanus' behavior, leading to his banishment from Rome. And of course, this means that he will withdraw to his, in fact, Salarian and Nomentanian strongholds, always looming over Rome. By the way, from the north, that adds sort of a layer of complexity to the strategical implications of the connection of Rome with the north, with the same imperial court, and many other actors. Now, later, Gregory V offers forgiveness to Nomentanus, permitting his return to Rome, right? Where this patrician commands broad public support, the people love him. And this tells you how the Roman lay power and authority was very strong from these baronial clans, in order to strengthen, in fact, the ambitions of a growing community. Again, almost a bit too early, but it's a proto-communal era that could have seen these families to rise to a level of a consulate of some sort. The papacy is here. Things would go differently, of course, but there is, again, you cannot understand the strength of the papacy until you realize against whom they had to contend. And not just the empire, but these very Roman families were, again, very aggressive, very arrogant, very unruly, very ambitious. Thus, during Otto's absence at this point in his empire from Rome, reignites Nomentanus' opposition to the Pope, who flees to Pavia, the capital of the Italic kingdom in Lombardy, for safety, but not before excommunicating him. So here you have a first instance of properly a papal overthrowing from the side of these lay Roman nobility. Soon after, realizing the peril Nomentanus is once again, Crescentius turns to the Byzantine ruler Basil II for aid. We are in the time of the Bulgaroctonus. Basil II would have liked to pass down to history as Porphyrogenitus, by the way. We would call him like that. And as you know, he is a hell of a ruler. He's one of the strongest, most powerful, more capable Byzantine leaders, right? Not just emperors per se. And the Byzantine Empire, in fact, is dramatically re-expanding both east and west. I made a couple of videos about Basil II. We'll come back, of course, on his figure hopefully soon. And that's a powerful figure you want to call in, considering that you have literally expelled the Pope. The imperial power is shaken at this point. Talking about, say, the Holy Roman Germanic one, so to say. And to curry Basil's favor, Nomentanus appoints an Hellenic Pope, John Philagathos, who is crowned John XVI, 985-986. There had historically always been a consistent Byzantine community in Rome. It was not so, the word the scholar of the Greeks, next to the other ones of the Germanic peoples. And this had been important figures, some refugees, right, from the iconoclasm, people of culture, normally, like it was in a Byzantine context, also from different areas that had suffered persecutions at the hands of the same Byzantine imperial authority. And Rome had a rich, let's say, a really rich paleographic and epigraphic Greek past in early medieval times. People like to stretch this too far, those things like Italians and Greeks are, same face, same all of this stuff. That's actually not the case, right? Rome was Latin, Italic, and, these were just essentially foreign communities. But it's important that in a historical sense, the same papacy and the local Roman families, that in theory, being part of now a papal dominion recognized as his own, had once been part of the Byzantine Duchy of Rome, drew, as we were hinting at before, some kind of further imperial grandeur from that Byzantine past in the same way. But the times were different than the ones from which, in fact, like the Romans were still struggling, in fact, to get rid of Byzantine influence, which also happened relatively quickly. Basil's assistance stalled by his campaigns against the Bulgars. As you know, as we were saying before, the Bulgar Octonus. The Byzantine army is involved in a pluri-decennial campaign in the Balkans against the Bulgarian Empire, which had been this looming threat over Constantinople in Thrace, and that was basically obliterated by this relentless, probably over-costly Byzantine campaigns. The Bulgarians, of course, were not really destroyed as a people. They maintained some of their administration, saying Byzantines needed to rule them, not to literally eradicate them. But it's draining an enormous amount of resources, and so now intervening in Rome for what? For making this noble happier, like going at war against the Holy Roman Empire? Well, that's not exactly feasible. There is probably a problem of reach to begin with, more or less the sense that the Byzantines could still operate at this point in southern Italy. This is pre-Norman era, right? So, and that central northern Italy were fundamentally now for good within a Germanic domain, a Germanic control is practically there. Now, as history records, Otto III returned to Rome in 998, exactly to deal with the defiant city leader and his kin. The Crescensi had essentially exaggerated once again, and escaping to Torre Astura, which is famous also because it's the location where 300 years later Conradin of Swabia would be betrayed and captured by the Frangipani, yet another Roman noble family, and handed over to Charles of Anjou after the crushing defeat of Tagliacozzo that I made a video about. Philagatus, so it was John XVI, was tracked down by the Saxons, by the Ottonians, maimed, blinded, and dragged back to the Urbs, where he is publicly shamed, then jailed and executed. Right, this is the time of Widukind of Corvey, of Liutprand of Cremona. We were talking about them just recently as the sources of the Battle of Riada. We made a video entirely on their period, the relation with Otto III and, say, the Italian policy and so on. If you're interested, you can check that out. Liutprand was, as you know, a staunch supporter of the emperor. Like he had of Otto I, then of his descendants, and he had been sent as an ambassador to Constantinople. There is all this recrimination in his works about the legation to Constantinople against the Byzantines. So obviously that reflects the hatred that the Ottonians in turn had against the Byzantines, that were always this looming threat for them. They could recover Rome in a way or another, at least sponsoring the enemies of the Holy Roman Emperor there, like in this case. And that's what basically the Ottonians do to this Pope that they hated as a Byzantine and propped by the Crescensi. Meanwhile, the Senator Nomentanus, trapped in turn, like the Pope had fled, he had been captured, trying to embark somewhere on the Roman coast. Nomentanus had remained to Rome, and he was trapped essentially during a siege at Castel Sant'Angelo, the Hadrian mausoleum, so that was already quite well fortified at the time before the Trace Italienne in the Renaissance was introduced. And he meets a similar fate. He's seized finally and hanged upside down from the castle's ramparts. We are in the same 998. So this tells you the sheer brutality of this Roman political life. The fact that essentially these figures were repaying one another with the same coin. This in particular was seen as an affront, the rise of the Crescensi as an affront to both imperial and papal authority, that here in perspective you understand a bit more like why they got themselves into that situation. Like imagine, Crescentius Nomentanus, hanging down, killed from Crescensius. You probably wonder how I got into this situation. And then it goes back into, and this makes sense, and it's also a ferocious display of imperial autocracy that says, we are the only ones who rule here. But as you know, it doesn't last long because the same Romans eventually will expel Otto III. And so it's this perennial cycle and this perennial struggle, after all, for Rome, which is basically the only reason in the history of mankind. Now, the exact spot, by the way, of Nomentanus' ghastly execution is still debated. We do not know. It's possible that this happened literally at Castel Sant'Angelo's fortress, just per se, while others point at Monte Mario in the north of the city that would have, from this event, reportedly remained Mons Malus, the evil mount, to essentially underscore the cruelty of Nomentanus' slaughter. Now, of course, we're not hyper-informed on the details like that unfolded here, like the precision about the chronology, the topography, so to say. Certain records think these are relatively, not mythical, but again, narrative sources in this context are crucial still. They always say something relevant, but again, if one says one thing and another, obviously that's another story in factual terms. That Nomentanus was laid to rest in the Church of San Pancrazio, that is a medieval church set aside for those betrayed, right? Implying that treachery was the cause of his seizure, right? And besieging Castel Sant'Angelo is not really easy, to say the least. So it's possible that he was betrayed from the within, or maybe he was granted some safe conduct and he was later captured and killed. So it's possible. This tells you again how powerful he was. And in fact, there is no question that the Romans admired and trusted Nomentanus. Consequently, his death carved a deep scar into the herbs, one that only began to heal with the ascent of his son. Remember the genetic continuity of the patriciate, John, to power, followed, by the way, by the banishment of Otto III and the reviled Saxons at this point. So this had caused that expulsion, like eventually, of the same emperor from the city, which is really crazy. There's a famous speech of Otto III to the Romans that sort of underscores the relative hypocrisy of the world system, meaning, you should be the emperor who manages to control everybody. You should be the one who protects the Romans. Essentially, you are able to gain the Holy Ghost necessary to control them, to really inspire them, etc. This was true also in the Saxon blood, in the war bands that we described very much in the Eliant, and in fact that very traditionally bound sense of Germanic warriorhood that, in fact, Widukind of Corbeil had spoken from in a sense, in a traditional Saxon fashion, opposing the notion that this was an empire of the Romans. This was more like an empire of the Saxons. But even so, the Saxons were expelled even from Rome, so this speaks volumes, after all, about the power of Rome, if anything, and the necessary one required to handle her. Adhemar of Shaban, which is this is a Gallic source of the era, records that the city of Rome grieved intensely when Crescentius died. An inscription in the aforementioned church in San Pancrazio honors his memory, highlighting how he kept civic order and won the people's approval. So I also inserted this in the pictures here at a point. And so we're talking really the cream of the Roman nobility. Also mirrored by, you see, this display of civic feeling that was incredibly promising. Also in a pre-communal direction. Remember that these places began earlier to sort of revive historically compared to the rest of Europe. So Rome had surely all the fundamentals, hadn't the Pope sort of being so obviously impositive, let's say, in the broader picture, develop into something very intense. This display also, for example, the epigraphic culture, the sense that there was something that entailed properly the entire Roman community's participation and grievance. Securing tranquility in a place like the Urbs Sancti Petri et Pauli was a remarkable achievement that must be credited to Nomentanus, to Crescentius, in a way that, again, is difficult to explain if you don't have a proper picture of how normally the world was ruled in the 10th century. Crescentius, Benedict's son, comes from the Stephanian lineage of the Crescensi family that we saw before. His father, as we've seen, was awarded the Sabine fief by John the 13th, because this was, again, in turn the child of John's sister, Stephania, hence the so-called Stephanian lineage, which women were particularly important also in the Roman nobility, very powerful. Think about Marosha, we will talk about her once again. We talk about her in the video about Hugh of Provence, but you kind of know the story. There is all a Black Legion, a stigma on her because of Liutprand of Cremona, and again was the pro-imperial side that disliked these Roman families in general. In any case, the sequence of affairs leads to the belief that this Crescentius here, Benedict's son, was born at the castrum of Arci in Sabina. Arces, at least in classical restituta, literally means fortress, citadel. So the castrum would have continued such position in the Middle Ages. And by the way, these are all cities that you can visit from Rome. They're very close, like by car. Like the Roman countryside is famously also very attractive, nature, traditions, and so on. Now, this idea holds also in terms of connections, if it's thought necessary to give this Crescentius a birthplace separate from Rome, which may have not been. Again, these people were Roman. They had different estates in the countryside, but they also lived in the city. So, especially in this case, it's not particularly relevant. But the branches, as we've seen, were separated in the moment in which the estates were scattered in different parts of the countryside. So that is important. So as Crescentius develops into a robust and dynamic individual, as it was expected from members of his clan, his family's political and economic sway expands with equal energy, especially in the Praenestine territory that, as we've seen, had already been conferred over to Stephania by John the 13th. And most significantly, in the regions governed by the imperial Farfa Abbey that are in Sabina. And this is yet another very important aspect of the story, that is the monastic possessions. They're very rich, very old, very strong, and Farfa in Sabina are, let's say, has such a spiritual influence that by falling under the control of the Crescensi can, of course, play very interesting games. So you have the Salarian branch, the Sabine branch, then this expands further even in the Farfa Abbey possessions in Praeneste in the southeast. So it's encircling Rome almost. In 991, Crescentius officially steps into the role of rector of Sabina, holding it until 994. So again, suggesting a lordship. The term rector was, of course, attributed in a broader either papal or public sense, or simply recognized from the Roman people as, this is our guy that has to lord over Sabina for us, and that has, in fact, to mostly hold, like the concept of rector. There are different shades in these administrative offices, but they are mostly, this is kind of a lord that has to hold power in the moment, in the place. Because, again, it's not like they owned Sabina. There were lots of other freemen, noblemen, monasteries, and so on. So this guy was, if anything, lording over them, protecting them, and administrating them in some way. Exercising justice. This with military retinues, by the way, because without Iron Fist, you couldn't have really a coercive power either. Around the same time, so we're at the very end of the 10th century, the death of John III, the influential abbot of Farfall, lets Crescentius increase his wealth by taking from the Benedictines. Especially at this point, there were other orders. The Cluniacs were there, but Rome, and especially Farfa, had such stronger Benedictine ethos. And it's weird that in all these years we've never made a video about the Benedictines by themselves. It's crazy if you think about it. Here, by the way, consider the times as well. The empire's fading. At least the Ottonians are a bit in crisis. They're busy also in northern Italy and so on. Germany's tumultuous indeed. And the Roman countryside has been recompacting from quite a while, right? From the beginnings of the 10th century under a strong seigneurial rule with a lot of encastellation and so on. So here we are in a phase where these families are holding sway in a really significant fashion. In fact, not yet content, Crescentius also claims the castrum of Ceri, that, again, if you look at the Roman countryside, is this fortified settlement northwest of Rome, right near the Tyrrhenian coast. We're talking 40 kilometers from Rome, right? So it's a day's march. A direct possession, however, of the Roman Church, right? This belonged to the Patrimonium. As you understand, this is a big deal because it's the move per se is the tipping point that proves too much. The Patrimonium Patri had been defended by the church at such a high level, and so here, even within the Roman system, you have laymen that are literally stating, with this action, we can't take over, right? This is very similar to the investiture controversy. It's no coincidence, as we were saying before, that the narratives, eventually the Gregorian historians, would align in stigmatizing both the imperial side and these Roman clans, because even though they fought actually against each other, they ultimately wanted to control the church. So you understand that the sense of power, as we've seen, this was a very violent context, and so we don't get all the nitty-gritty details of this, but you can't sort of understand the weight, the burden of it, because it was at the end of the day, like the rest of 10th, 11th century Europe, like creating these seigneuries by conquering this and that castle. There are enormous sort of managerial, even business issues behind this, but it's also mostly a political and military issue. As a result of these actions, Otto III, prompted by the Pope, captured the mighty feudal lord Crescentius, making his release contingent on relinquishing Ceri. You can imagine all the military clienteles that still obeyed Crescentius, and so they threatened the same emperor, the same Pope in here, from the countryside and from the city. When news of this dire situation reached Benedict, Crescentius' father, he raced to Rome to save his son, aware of what had happened to the Nomentanus, by the way, pledging, in fact, to return the taken Ceri. Yet, without securing the valuable hostage still in Ottonian custody, he made this promise and then dashed off to Ceri, shutting himself in with his armed followers. Right? This is even more interesting because the sense how courageous this clanic mobster mentality really is. I mean, these are really, again, the militants of the situation, really violent. They don't want to give up what they have taken. It's an incredibly serious issue. And so the Stephanians' plans and maneuvers grow hazy as a consequence in this situation. What's clear, however, is that Otto because there is a contradiction. Like first, relinquish the city, and then actually same father that asked for this goes shut himself into the same chair. The clear thing here is that Otto III and Pope Gregory V, with Crescentius bound and at the forefront of their army, advanced towards the papal stronghold, menacing the prisoner with death. Right? Only at that moment does his father Benedict see he has no bargaining power and gives up the castrum to ensure his son's safe return. At least this pater-filial relation was saved. But it shows you the degree of violence involved. After the emperor's passing in 1002, Crescentius rebuilds his influence, earning the titles of Count and Rector of Sabina in 1004. The comital addition is more powerful than the rectorate because the latter, as we've seen, is just a provisional government of some sort. The comitatus is instead a public authority, and it's also very lay in nature. So it does technically not belong to the papal administration either. It's more like an imperial title. During this period, and that's no coincidence because, again, emperors pass, etc., but the notion that this is a lay power that has to manifest against also a priesthood like the clergy that is to be subordinate to the warlike leaders, like in the imperial Ghibelline ideology. And as we were discussing even yesterday about, in fact, the primal position of the patriciate, at least in ancient Rome, warriors were in charge of, they had actually priestly powers themselves, right? It's not like in India, say, that the Brahmana had just, they were the priests and were even superior in power to the rulers, right? And to the warriors. Now, during this period, Crescentius' name crops up often in documents of land purchases and tales of wartime raids, to the extent that some deeds not truly his are linked to him. But these are still very important sources for the time, because they are basically the major indicators of this guy's tripudium, right? Land purchases are, of course, deriving from legal documents, because most of what you study in, history of law at this point in history is whose land is this and what kind of rights are there. So whose rights are on it. And of course, he is there. He is active. He is buying, purchasing, but also invading, conquering, and so on. The same is mirrored by narrative sources that really tell us that this guy organized military expeditions with the same support of the Romans. This is perhaps one of the single most important and famous aspect of the wall, because there is all historiographical orientation that studies fundamentally the existence of a Roman army throughout all this period that, of course, next to a papal signories is sort of a bit difficult to trace. There was historically a militia Romanorum that also quickly emancipated itself from the duchy of Rome, right, of Byzantine, of Justinian memory. But there is a lot, and I know this for some reason, because I know one person that is extremely close to these topics, and I was thinking about the enormity behind this all. But as we were saying at the beginning, I think it's pretty fair to assess that, in fact, Rome still routinely supported the Crescensi to wage war against different other clans and or expanding the Crescensi's lay power to stamp the papal temporal authority. That was gradually increasing at this point. Crescentius may have taken on and kept the position of Roman prefect as well. So one of top administrative relevance in the urbs until 1012. This is still debated, frankly. This is possibly stretching up to 1018, by the way. Either way, this time represents the height of the Stephanians' authority, given that, again, the Ottonians have faded and the papacy is not yet quite a principality on its own. And based in the Rhaetine area, so in the northeast of Rome, the Crescensi extend their rule over the lower Sabine and even the papal city, Rome herself. However, everything shifts sharply with Emperor Henry II's rise to power, who urged by the Farfa monks and stepping into Otto III's role as heir, even though he was, he was descending like as an imperial, like he was after, but was his nephew really, into that more important role that objectively Otto had also been compared to his uncle as an emperor, aims to halt the Crescensis misdeeds and looting, right? Henry does become emperor, and so he has a leverage on the Roman countryside and surroundings, and the monks of Farfa began to signal him, look, this nobleman here is basically, of course, Henry knew about the whole thing, even though, of course, the Bavarian branch had historically sabotaged the Saxon one. So it's even, I would think it's sure, I would bet on the fact that at some point that branch had even had contacts with the Crescensi to sort of damage the Saxon branch of the Ottonians to some degree, of course. And this accusation of misdeeds and looting does make sense because, again, seigneurial power was affirming itself everywhere. We've seen it also very well in the later Gregorian reforms and when wars broke out in Italy, in Germany, for the investiture controversy. In fact, there was this inherent, again, Ghibelline mentality whereby the lay knights would think that at some point the property of the clergy was to take or to simply more traditionally frame within hierarchical order, the top of which the knights, this lay noblemen, really were. So we can imagine how Crescensis would have sort of exacted toll, and by the way, not even in this truly predatory sense. Surely in a rational, intelligent fashion, as you explained, for many of his ranks, to build some very strong power. Still, and this is very significant, before Henry II can fully triumph over Crescentius, one of Rome's frequent anti-imperial rebellions flares up. Not started by the Crescensi, apparently, but enough to postpone Henry's suppression efforts, right? Surely there was some connection, because it was the same. But in general, the Romans had backed the Crescensi, and now the imperial presence in the Urbs was not too welcome in general. There is this very balanced situation whereby so much is actually changing the history of the city, and Henry, as you know, has a role in Italy for a while, but he also comes relatively quickly back to the north of the Alps, and that's also, their own German priority in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, of course. Now, although the Roman factions are eventually quelled in a bloody crackdown, by the way, Henry presses his attack on Crescentius and his most prosperous, well-defended holdings. This tells you how important it had been, even for, of course, this newly crowned emperor to assert his power over the Crescensi, to maintain some greater grip on Rome, even on the distance. Yet, before clinching a total win, the emperor must head back to Germany due to critical challenges in managing that key region, as we were just saying. He departed only after pressing the Pope to wrap up the military push against the Stephanians. Thus, Crescentius is finally defeated and banished with all his belongings confiscated. This is rough, right? And in fact, by 1014, the Crescensis family strength seems utterly shattered. This is also relatively, however, inaccurate, because within a few years, the situation changes once again. Of course, how could you really eradicate this nobleman from the countryside? This was the whole problem that will become even sort of longer over time later. In fact, ties between the papacy and empire fray, and Hugh of Farfa, so a quite informed source on even like the same places we're discussing here, narrates how in 1022 the Pope, seeking to thwart the same Henry II, because that's always how it sort of somehow ended, but through the greater oppression, say from the imperial side of on the church, turned to the former Stephanian foes for support. Surprise, surprise. This is what we were saying before. These are the events that really show also why the papacy in a few decades really will provide itself with a monarchic profile, right? There is a lot going on in the rest of Europe regarding also the instances of Reformation in Italy, in Gaul. Here we're looking at the Benedictines, etc. So there is a really a need, because the world is looking at Rome and it says, here we have to fix the system in a way or another. The church must acquire her own independence from lay powers altogether. It would have been actually a very radical stance. As you know, it didn't really even fully kick in at the death of Gregory VII. It seemed like with him, right, the entire point died, right? And in fact, it's actually later popes, more than Gregory himself, that gave the name to the reforms that, in fact, plural reforms that enacted the changes needed to win the investiture controversy against the emperor. And this is the crucial aspect. You need the sword. That's what we always said about this period, the age. The temporal and spiritual powers cannot be ever fully separated in a human sense. That would be like an almost agnostic concept. But the repartition is necessary in their combined arms, so to say, in its synergy. They all need one another. So the emperor first used the arms against Crescensis. Now, the emperor had become too impositive. This means the Pope has not really an army to defend himself with, right? And so what he does when the emperor becomes too oppressive is that he reinstates the Crescensi in their old lands, restarting their usual assaults on the Benedictines of Farfa, by the way, that are really, the apparently, like, really the only sort of innocent victims in the picture. And this shows how Crescentius' fortunes are, by the way, tied first to Henry II, then to Benedict VIII, and also to the same Farfa monks, after all, because, as we see, at some point, some of them would have even supported him. In this new dynamic, Crescentius reclaims the prefecture of Rome, maintaining it with fresh resolve, by the way, potentially until 1032, and so this shows how he's fully reinstated properly in Rome, within the city gates, and again, in all the palaces. Crescensi really leave an archaeological trail of splendor and of also artistic refinement. It really shows you how rich, wealthy, and powerful Rome was at the time. And the last mentions of Crescentius appear in a Subiaco record from 1038. Subiaco is, by the way, one of the single most other important centers of Benedictine monasticism. Really, we must talk about these places. The Benedictine reforms in the previous centuries, it's so crucial, right? It's also beautiful. It's immersed in the natural park of the Cimbrinian Mountains. Again, the landscape by itself is the Roman countryside is fascinating as well. By the way, Crescentius likely dies by the century's midpoint. This is very interesting in historical perspective, because it's as if an era ended and that one of the Gregorian reforms kicked in. So the age of the counts of Tusculan, of the Crescensi, of the Renovatio Imperii, of the Varius Italicum, it's basically over. It's really a world turning page in many ways. And by the way, this last Crescentius is in brief a captivating figure. He's stormy. In some ways, we see an inconstancy, not an inconsistency. Like he's often at odds with earlier decisions that, however, seem appropriate for the volatile political landscape that we can also barely reconstruct. We understand the major dynamics, as we've seen. He backed the emperor when the latter is frail and distant, yet challenges him when he approaches and turns menacing. This was, in many ways, what you were condemned to, like when dealing with these particular powers. Sometimes Crescentius seems determined to shake off the Pope's heavy-handed supervision, only to later lean on him and act in his stead when, as we've seen, the same Pope required his support. And almost by instinct, Crescentius sets himself against the Farfa Benedictines that are seemingly the polarizing center of his attention because of the incredible spiritual legacy that this place owned. So getting Farfa means to get a large chunk of Central Italian monasticism. And these Benedictines, after opposing Henry II, went up contrary to their own aims, propping the same Crescentius, as we were hinting at before. So this is, again, extremely interesting because I think it captures pretty well the seigneurial essence that probably almost the abandon that these men had over literally Rome and her surrounding. These men had the manpower, had the soldiers, had the forces to maintain a regime. This is really the measure of Roman nobiliar power. One could really handle even this clash between the papacy and the empire. And that, as you see here, maintain an important balance because you can't really be both against papacy and empire, but locally in Rome, the support of one is enough to basically keep the other out. This is unsurprising, but again, the attention should be really focused on the level of military organization that the urbs had at this point, because we know a very few about this. But at the same time, even without explicit evidence, you realize that these forces could have not simply come just from feudal holdings, right? There is the freaking Rome. And in Italy, as we've seen also in the videos about the genesis of the communes, it's urban power that really makes things go on, right? So there are many sources we should look at, but for example, just if you want a Milanese perspective on this, I made a video about the strength at this point. I'll actually search it for you, about the power of the Milanese army roughly around the same time. And Milan, of course, was a hell of a power in many ways. But here it is, Milites strenuissimi et pedites fortes. This happened at the time of the Pataria, so we're basically towards the end of this period. It is likely beyond. Erlenbald, Landulf, the Milanese army built up. This shows you, by the way, what kind of sort of similarity even exists between a city like Milan, that naturally was something very, but this was rising to be the largest city in Europe, as a matter of fact. So it's very powerful, right? And very, very strong military speaking, but it's so turbulent. And as we've seen very often in the videos about the Pataria, everything here was linked with Rome, right? The papacy heavily interfered in Milanese affairs to sustain, even there, the popular support of local forces that eventually will end up essentially creating the communes. So a bit like these lay forces that you see in Rome, except there, that's where the Pope was, so that they couldn't do it against themselves. In fact, not to make mostly the emperor prevail in Milan. And that's in many ways how the same communal forces developed on the basis of this local military power. Thus, it's incredibly important here to focus and realize we know enough about Milan. We do not know too much about Rome in the same way for the period in terms of military organization, Roman people, but if we look at them, we know that essentially, as we've seen in many videos, that central northern Italian warfare was practically the same. You can argue that with all the distinctions in size, etc., Rome, the Crescensi, their militias were fundamentally structured in the same ways. And again, when we talk militias at this point, we're not just talking about the English way of to militia, like in a linguistic sense, but literally the militia, the militas, so the knights that surely were supported by peditas that surely also in Roman history later on did prove always incredibly austic against any kind, especially within the city gates, but not only. And that in fact had an ambition, as we've seen in the video about medieval Lazio, over these other towns, some of which we named here. I think I made a playlist about medieval Lazio. Is it? No. No, we haven't. But we could and we should. We have one about medieval central Italy, for that matter, where you can find interesting stuff. In fact, well, okay, there's plenty of Tuscan stuff, unavoidably, for central Italy, but there's medieval Rome, medieval Lazio I have to create, because at some point, yeah, medieval Rome, and surely this video is going to be in medieval Rome and medieval Rome 1. Yes, we have to make more about medieval Rome, by the way. Really more, because it's too important. Really, really too important. But there's also a lot about medieval papacy and beyond, so we don't have to literally be that negative. If anything, however, this is always something we unavoidably need to look at more in depth, because as you understand, it's just a universe. So imagine making a movie about this. Like, this is so freaking cool. I mean, I understand that, I don't know, this is the usual rhetoric I said. Everybody thinks this, what year is this? Year 1000, because it's Viking era, it's Viking times. Yeah, okay, we talk about the Vikings, we like the Vikings, but do you realize the scale of things happening here, right? It's obviously, like, at large, continental Europe was way more interesting than Scandinavia. Scandinavia has an amazing late medieval history, for example. Nobody cares about just because there are the Vikings before. And these are the things that really drive me mad, in a sense, because it's there, like, you have so much, but you can't get things in historical perspective. And so it is frustrating. It is frustrating, but it's also why we make history. That's the motivation, the sap of why we make these videos. Otherwise, really, we would really stop to the 5 minutes, not even long videos, right? So that's, in my opinion, incredibly important. And as long as we continue this, I don't know how many views this makes. Usually, when it's about medieval Rome, unless there is nice thumbnail or whatever, like, no, you actually watch it, but people do not, again, as I said at the beginning of the video, usually fully appreciate the meaning of this stuff, like how important it actually is and why you should talk about it. But again, I'm incredibly happy to discuss these topics. I'm very much eager to cover, say, history at the same level, the way we see here in other, like, we have to cover the entire medieval history. This way, here, I think, I don't know whether we made 2 hours, perhaps a bit less. Anyway, we talked a lot for today. I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.